So today we're going to be doing a full walkthrough on this car. Came to us as a rendering inspired by the Hoonicorn. We just wanted to give a breakdown of all the details that went into this. We have it on scales right now. As you can see, at some point we're going to be giving an overall weight of the car, all of the aluminum work, sheet metal work that went into it, talk about some of the questions that you guys had. So this 67 Mustang came to us about a year ago, just as a rolling chassis. It's on a Scott's Hot Rod custom frame. It has an LS3 in it. We don't know a whole lot about it, but I know it has blueprint heads, Magnuson supercharger. We're told it makes about 850 wheel. Underneath the car here, some of the other components that were on it when it came to us, paired up to the LS3, we have a set of sequential gearbox. On the Scott's Hot Rod frame, we have their Weldon IFS front suspension kit, adjustable uppers, RideTech coilovers, power steering rack, and then front and rear, it does have a Weldon fully adjustable sway bar kit. For the brakes, up front here, we have Woolwood 6 pistons. And then in the rear, I know a bunch of people have asked about this one, the rear setup. So down here we have Woolwood's electronic parking brake. This guy, we were using a 4-piston for the hydraulic handbrake, and then another 4-piston in the rear just for your normal brakes. Underneath here, suspension-wise, it's a fully adjustable 4-link setup. Ford 9-inch rear end, adjustable Watts link. Normally it's pretty hard to take over where another shop left off, but honestly this car is in a really good spot for us to take over and finish the build. So the car did come to us with headers back to this X-pipe built already. One of the big main concerns for me was just gonna be clearance and exhaust routing. The customer did have these boom tubes that he wanted to utilize with side exit. How the car sat, the exhaust probably would have been sitting about 3 inches lower than it is. So the first thing I did, chop this frame support here so we had clearance to run the exhaust. Bent up this tube here, slugged the tubing, welded it all the way around. And then all of this frame and structure here had to be notched and plated along with the outside of the rocker here. That was all notched, plated, welded, and then blended out just so the exhaust could get tucked up high enough. So you can see a little bit better here, this frame section, how that was all cut out, notched, plated, TIG welded. Once there was clearance in place for these boom tubes here, then we went ahead and built out the rest of the exhaust. We added these exhaust isolators and brackets in the back here, as well as up top. So the next big project that we had to tackle was all the sheet metal in this car. Started with the rear tubs here, and then this main rear floor, which carries back into the trunk. Back in the trunk here, you can see the rear portion of these tubs, along with the vertical wall and all of the rest of the rear paneling in the trunk. We had to build off these little pockets here just to close up the rest of the trunk. Added some bead rolls there. There's more bead rolling throughout the car, just as a design aspect, but also adds rigidity to all of these panels here, just so you don't have any panels that are gonna be popping in and out on you. Once we had the main portion of the rear floor in place, we had to build a bulkhead to close off the trunk and fuel cell from the interior. We started with this main panel here, and then up top here, it's actually 2 pieces to be able to fit around the rear of the roll cage. We rolled a step all the way across the center that you can see, and then both rear sections were spot welded together. Moving forward here, the next main pieces were the floor pans and transmission tunnel. At the back here of the floor pans, this kind of gives you a better idea of all the clearance that we had to make in order to fit the exhaust. You can see how much this section's raised. The boom tubes fit right underneath this panel. On the transmission tunnel itself here, you'll notice there's a few little bumps and pockets that were added. One of the main things with this car, we just wanted to make sure that everything was accessible and serviceable as possible. This big bump, that's for the shift fork and shift assembly itself. So you're able to get under there and adjust it if need be, or remove the shift rod. On the passenger side of the transmission tunnel, you'll see this upper and lower bump here. Those are added in place just so there's extra room around the fittings on the transmission itself, so you can get an AN wrench up there, remove the lines, service it if need be. In the interior here, we're dealing with a lot of different shapes and contours, so a lot of the panels had to be built out of separate pieces of metal. There's kind of a right and wrong time to grind your welds down. In this application, we really wanted the interior to have a seamless, clean look. So we ended up TIG welding everything, made sure there's proper penetration front and rear. And also the advantage of that is there's very little material to have to sand down on the face side. So next step was pulling the whole drivetrain out so we could build a firewall, get this car closed all the way up. Made this piece here removable just so we can pull the drivetrain straight out the front, made things super easy. Back here, it's kind of hard to see with the engine in place, but we'll throw up some clips. We built the main firewall panel, built this recess box for the master cylinders that ties into the pedal box inside. Built this little mount here to keep things simple for the master cylinder reservoirs. So this car came to us with a basic outline of a 6-point cage, these roof bars, and some gussets tying into the A-pillars. We added everything here in the main hoop, these door bars, and these rear tubes tying into the frame right overhead of where we notched underneath for the exhaust, adding a little bit of extra structure there. These door bars here aren't really our typical door bar that we do. For the customer's request, he just wanted something that still had a little bit of safety aspect to it. His main concern was just being able to get in and out of the car easily. After we got the firewall in place, we had to finish up the front portion of the main floor pan here. That was kind of a good time to set a seat in here, figure out seat position and pedal box, steering column placement. Flaming River steering column mounted up here. Willwood hanging pedal box in place. Since the steering column intersects between the clutch and brake pedal pretty close here, kind of forced us to have to notch into the transmission tunnel just to allow clearance of this throttle pedal. With the bulk of the sheet metal work done, we moved on to the rear quarter panels here. Radius the inner and outer skin to match the radius of the inner tubs, and then extended those all the way out to the quarter panel. Finish welded it, sanded off any rough edges so nothing sharp there. While we could have built custom flares for this car, our customer really wanted to use these clinch flares, mainly because they're inexpensive, flexible, easy to swap out if something was to happen to them. Threw rib nuts in the quarter panels, used stainless hardware just so we're able to bolt it on and remove it pretty easy. So while the drivetrain was still out in this car, we needed to seal up all the bare metal that we worked on up to this point. Seam sealed the car top and bottom, and then covered everything in this Steelit. This stuff's super nice. It's anti-corrosive, weldable, super easy to touch up spots if you need to, and it blends out really well. Once everything dried up, threw the drivetrain back in the car since we didn't need it out anymore, and moved on to modifying the hood and front bumper to fit. So moving to the front here, our customer wanted to convert the front end to GT500 style. So there were a few modifications that had to be done. Obviously, big one is making the hood fit. Took a handful of measurements, started off small, mainly some measurements from the edge of the fenders and the cowl forward, marked out on the hood, just to figure out where the main shape of the supercharger was going to be. So I'll pull this guy off here. This hood's all aluminum, by the way. Started off small with the cuts. As always, you can always take more off. Figure out the main shape. There was some notches and clearance that had to happen on the underside here. I believe right where the coil packs sit, just so there's enough room for the hood to sit down. So with the main shape cut out to fit around the supercharger, let me get this guy on real quick. We're able to come back up top here, just mark out a cleaner perimeter around the whole engine, intake, supercharger, whatnot. Remove it, cut some straight lines, round off all the corners, and really clean everything up for a nice fit and finish. We added 4 Aero catch hood pins, front and rear. Makes this thing really easy to pop on and off, lock down, super secure. The next piece to the front end was getting this replica GT500 bumper fit up. This one's just fiberglass, so with any fiberglass, it's gonna take quite a bit of work in order to get it fit up properly. The first main thing that we ran into were the original headlight buckets in the factory fenders here. So ended up drilling out all the spot welds in order to remove those buckets completely and let the bumper sit against the fenders how it needs to be. I also went around and hammer and dollied this lip here just to get it to sit flush. After that, there was kind of a bunch of trimming and grinding that needed to happen on the fiberglass, and I like to use a heat gun with fiberglass just to help manipulate a little bit more. So bolted it onto the fenders, kind of pulled it tight, and it was a combination of pulling it together while we were heating it just to get it to sit up properly how it should. With the front bumper all bolted up in place, that allowed us to pull all the dimensions that we needed to for this front tube bumper. I like using thinner wall tubing for something like this. Just allows more of a crumple zone on the outside. That way you're not gonna be bending frame rails. This is gonna take the impact first. Started off with capping the ends of the frame rails with nuts welded on the inside so we could bolt this directly to it. And then bent up the upper and lower bar, which fit perfectly inside of that bumper. We ended up adding mounts to this front tube bumper itself for the transmission cooler, added mounts to mount the bumper itself, and then some tabs on here as well for the splitter rods. There were a few other systems in the engine bay itself that we needed to finish up. So the first one was this heat exchanger here. We ended up mounting it directly in front of the engine radiator, welded these bungs onto the radiator and these tabs onto the heat exchanger to be able to bolt it right up. We're using Ron Davis heat exchanger, radiator, and a dual spall fan setup, so it should be plenty efficient. Down here on the frame rail, we have the Bosch water pump. It's directly in line with the inlet on the heat exchanger. We had to make a couple brackets there and up here for the reservoir itself. The intake, we wanted to route out and away from all the hot air, so built it coming down to the front of the passenger side, and then out the bodywork here, we hole sawed that, and it sits right behind the grill area. On the intake itself, we then added a couple bungs for intake air temp and the MAF sensor up here. We're using these same clinch flares up front here. So once we found a good mounting spot for those, we went through, radiused the whole fender, used rib nuts, stainless hardware again. Originally, we had these flares mounted further in directly to the fender, and with the wheels mounted, we were running into some clearance issues. So to solve that, we ended up making these fender extensions here, welded them, blended them out, which allowed us to pull this flare a little bit further out and provide the clearance that we needed. Over here on the passenger side, we have the flare off so you can get a better idea of that. There's a big radius that we did for clearance. And then here's the extension. You can see how much it pulled it out. There's probably 3-4 inches here that we were able to pull the flare out. Another little design aspect that we added here were these fender vents. We measured all the way back as far as we could to where the body meets inside the fender, and then cut out this whole shape. I took this back section, folded it in, and then made a upper and lower channel to kind of direct the air through. And then these fins that are in place actually match that same contour of the fender. So if you look from the front, you can see that there's a little bit of shape to them. It's not straight up and down. So the next main thing that we had to take care of was all the plumbing for this car. All of the fuel lines and transmission lines on this are PTFE hose. It's a Teflon line. We could have totally used your normal rubber and hose. We like using the PTFE hose. It has a higher chemical resistance. It's not going to deteriorate as fast. This car, we're not totally sure what fuel he's going to run in the future, so we kind of just wanted to safeguard it with that. Up top here, we have dash 8 feed, dash 6 return, bulkhead fittings in the trunk from the fuel cell. That comes forward to this fuel filter. We have some bulkhead frame pass-throughs here. DI heat wrap just to help insulate the lines. Both feed and return run all the way along the transmission tunnel up to the front. And then up top here, it's kind of hard to see, but on the Firewall, we have the fuel pressure regulator mounted. And then we have that feed line I was talking about that runs along the back of the Firewall and then over here to the fuel rail. Another thing to note too, this engine bay isn't super tidy right now. It's not finalized, kind of roughly in place. So just keep that in mind. So touching on the transmission cooler that we had previously mounted up front here, we have dual dash 8 fittings, inlet and outlet. Those run from here all the way back to the engine bay and then follow the fuel lines back to the transmission. While we have the car down here on the ground, kind of gives a better look in the trunk at the fuel system. We have a couple more lines, feed and return, to go off the fuel cell up there to those bulkhead fittings that we had talked about before. We'll move on to the hydraulic handbrake here since it's on its own separate system. So here's the Willwood handbrake. We had previously made a little bracket coming off the transmission tunnel here. Super nice and solid. Bent up all stainless line. We're using dash 3 fittings. It is tucked and routes super nice along the transmission tunnel up to that bulkhead fitting that goes down underneath the car. We have a few of these billet aluminum clips to help fasten it to their transmission tunnel. We'll go under the car to get a better look at the full brake system. So starting at this bulkhead fitting from the hydraulic handbrake inside, this line runs down over to the frame rail, continues up the passenger frame rail to a T-fitting that branches off to this front caliper, and then continues on the back of the car over to the driver frame rail up to this other caliper. Like we talked about before, there's a second set of calipers. That's just for your normal foot brake. So same concept, we have stainless lines that branch off and run to both sides, and then a main line that comes down the driver frame rail to this bulkhead fitting. From there, you're able to remove it to service any lines that you need to. We have a main line from that bulkhead fitting that runs the center section of this car all the way along the transmission tunnel up to fittings and then up to the master cylinder. From the front master cylinder, we have a line that runs up along the subframe and again branches off to both front side calipers. All of the plumbing, if you've done this before, you know it's super tedious getting all the lines bent up properly so it fits how it should, but in the end it's super nice. It's a really clean way to make all your lines. Here's the full aluminum kit. We really wanted to go a little more in depth on. We had quite a few questions regarding it. All the aluminum that we use for the side splitter, the front splitter, rear diffuser, it's all 6000 series, 3/16 thick aluminum. In our previous little video we weighed it all just to see the overall weight, and all the combined aluminum that we had made weighed 85 pounds. In the grand scheme of things, it didn't add a whole lot of weight to the car. Also, one of the main things to mention too, we had some people asking about aerodynamics and whatnot and added weight. The majority of this stuff was added just for aesthetics. The customer really liked the look of it, so it might be beneficial, but that wasn't the main purpose of it all. We'll show it mounted, all of this mounted on the car as well, but with the front splitter, kind of ties into a skid plate as well to protect the underside. Side splitter here, we have these big holes that were cut out for the pucks to jack the car up with. The rear diffuser. We have the rear wing also, which we had a lot of questions about on a few of these parts, why we didn't just put it in a metal brake and bend it versus welding it and whatnot. One of the big reasons, well, to start with, our metal brake, some of this stuff just wouldn't fit in. With the 3/16 material and 6000 series, we also really didn't want to risk any breaks or fatiguing the material once we bent it, because this is bent up at, I don't know, probably 70, 85 degrees. On the bottom side here, the biggest reason why we didn't just put it in a metal brake and bend it, right? The shape of the trunk, there's a slight contour on it. It's kind of hard to see. This will give you a lot better idea. I have this straight edge. I'll just put it on the base. You can see that this bottom plane isn't completely flat. So if we put it in a metal brake and just bent it up at 80, 90 degrees, it wouldn't follow that same curve and it wouldn't lay flat on the trunk. So I started with the main base piece, bolted that to the trunk to get that same contour so it matched the trunk, and then welded on this back section. Front and back was welded, and then went through, sanded it all down so it's nice, clean, and seamless. Hopefully that will kind of answer why we chose to do it the way we did and our reasoning behind it. We'll go through and talk about how we mounted all of this stuff. So starting at the front splitter. Also, it's worth to mention, all of the hardware for these pieces, all the holes were drilled, countersunk. It's using recessed hardware. So underneath the car, like you can see here on the splitter, it's all nice and flat. None of the hardware is gonna get caught or ground down. Up front here for the front splitter, at the rear, we'll just call this the subframe. These holes were all drilled and tapped. So it has 4 bolts running across the back to bolt it up. Along this front cross member here, we have these brackets that we made with threaded inserts welded in. Bolts up back here, bolts up along this cross member, and then along the front of this tube bumper I had mentioned before, we welded on these tabs for the splitter rods support. These just bolt right to it. The splitter rods go down to the splitter itself. Super beefy. I mean, I haven't physically stood on it, but you can grab it and pull down on it and it's not gonna move at all. The side splitters that we made, so another thing where it's just a lot of tedious work that goes into it just to be able to mount it properly. It's not just throwing it up underneath with some self-tappers or some random hardware. Bent up these little brackets, again, some threaded inserts welded on the back side. So these run along the frame of the car. And then we have these tube pieces that are coped and notched, welded on to these bottom cross members. These are also threaded. So the whole splitter bolts up to those. We added these little stanchions to be able to jack up on or put it on a lift easily. Those are what those holes on the side splitters were for. So those just drop down just enough to be able to get a jack on without damaging or running into the bottom of the splitters itself. On this side, we still have the side splitter installed, so you can see how that sticks down just a hair, just enough to be able to get a jack on. Back at the rear here, we just wanted to go over the mounting for the rear diffuser. Along the frame at the back here, we have this cross member. We just have 4 threaded holes there, mounts the rear of the diffuser, and then along the front, we did threaded nutserts in the inner fender well. So makes the diffuser super easy to install, take off if need be. That was kind of one of the main things, just serviceability like we talked about before. At the rear, we have this factory finish panel. We really wanted to use that just to be able to finish off the rear of the car so it didn't look awkward underneath with any frame exposed and whatnot. The one thing we had to do though, because of this cross member spanning the width of the car, so this is the normal shape, it ties into the rear quarters. We had to cut a slit down both sides right on the outside of this cross member and then make this filler piece to be able to push the center part back just so it would fit properly. And then we ended up, I think this thing stuck down a couple inches further and ran into the diffuser. So we cut off a couple inches of that just straight across. Now it fits up good with the diffuser and finishes off the end of the car. There were a couple factory lights on both corners here. You can see the bare steel. So we ended up patching those, blending that out, and that'll all get body worked and painted down the road. And that's kind of the rear of the car. Up on the trunk here, we just wanted to go over how we went about mounting the wing. So we used nutserts, spans the whole width of the trunk. We have 9 of them in place. The reason why we did that, there's a whole inner structure underneath the trunk. Most of these nutserts where the wing needed to be mounted lands inside of that structure. And we didn't want to end up cutting that and lose some of the integrity underneath. Those, along with these rear support rods, make the wing plenty strong enough. Normally, I wouldn't really recommend using nutserts for anything structural, just because there is a chance that it could pull out. But again, being that it's going across the whole width of the trunk and with those rear supports, it's plenty strong. Another little thing that we wanted to do, normally there's a lock cylinder here. You have to use a key in order to access the trunk. Customer didn't really want to do that, so we just made this simple little turn, get rid of the lock cylinder, and makes it easy to latch and unlatch the trunk to open it. Another little piece while we're in the trunk here, because of the cage and tubs and everything, there's normally rods that run across that act as a spring to hold this trunk up. We didn't have those anymore, so there's nothing to actually support the trunk and hold it up. It's kind of a nuisance when you're working back here. I grabbed this stainless rod, used a die, make threads on the end of this rod, use this little heim and built a bracket. So that bracket's welded onto the trunk. This heim just bolts straight through. I was looking around to see what I had. I ended up using the end of a harness latch here and built this little tab. So that thing just comes up and latches. That locks in place. Welded a little stainless washer on here just for it to sit on the trunk. Yeah, kind of a, I don't know, nice simple little solution. When you're done with it, this thing just goes back down and locks right in place. While we're in the trunk here, just wanted to talk about the batteries real quick. You probably noticed in some of the other clips, we have 2 of them back here in the trunk. So the reason for that, the customer wanted a separate one just for the whole audio system. He's planning on doing a full stereo and speakers and whatnot in this car. The other battery is just our normal car battery to power everything else. At the bottom here, built just a simple tray to house both batteries, and then we have this upper clamp that we made that bolts front and rear just to secure both the batteries down. Let's talk about the wheels real quick. Customer went with these forge line wheels. They're 19 by 13 front and rear. Can't remember the offset completely offhand. Front has a slightly higher offset. They have 345/30s all around. Pretty big, meaty setup. I'm gonna roll one of the fronts up here. We'll mount that and then cover a handful of the clearance modifications that we had to do just to make these fit and be able to turn. With the front wheels mounted up now, we'll kind of give you a better idea of some of the clearance modifications we had to do. So up front here, this bodywork originally carried back to about here. We had to cut all of that out and create a little pocket there for the wheel and tire to actually sit into. So I'll cycle this. You can see that. Also, on the rear, the front sides of both frame rails, we had to cut and notch these, cut it back and plate those, sorry. And then on the driver's side, we did end up having plenty of clearance. The bodywork is a little bit different, but on the back side here, kind of same concept as the passenger front. We had to cut all of this out and build this little pocket for the rear of the driver tire to sit into. I'll turn that. So it's still pretty tight down there, but we have all the room that we need now. Doesn't hit any of the bodywork or sheet metal. The one thing that we did end up doing, it gets pretty close up to the front sway bar and also to the frame in the rear. So we ended up using just these slip-in steering rack limiters, and they go, if you pop these boots off on the steering rack itself, they're just these nylon spacers that you can add. You can stack them up just to be able to limit the steering and have more of a steering stop. So we did add a couple of those on both sides just to stop the travel right before hitting the sway bar and the frame, so that he wouldn't have to worry about making contact on the front or rear. Here's another view from the top side in the engine bay, these pockets or reliefs that we had to make for more clearance in the wheel well. Here's that driver's side rear. You can see it kind of bulges out. Gives them plenty of clearance back there. And then on the passenger in front here, it's kind of buried, but you can see that. Because of the front suspension changes, all of this was just wide open. Obviously, if he's gonna be driving on street or track, figured it'd be nice to kind of close that up just so we didn't have dirt and debris and whatnot coming up into the engine bay. We just wanted to make something kind of simple that would be able to be removed pretty easily, just so you could get in here and make suspension changes. We just made these boxes more or less on the driver and passenger side. Kind of turn around, you can see it. So pretty simple. This just slips down, covers all that suspension, gets bolted in, stainless hardware there. You can see the passenger side still have it bolted in just to protect everything from coming in. One thing on these, again, kind of like the rear wing, we had some people asking, why didn't you just bend this up in the brake? Why did you make it out of multiple pieces? Hopefully you can kind of see and hear just some of the different shapes and changes in shape, just to be able to go around. Like the driver's side, had to clear some of the power steering hoses and some other sheet metal work inside the engine bay. Made it a little bit easier just to be able to make some of these out of multiple pieces, and then we have the front and rear flange to bolt it in. Back in the car here, one of the things that's probably hard to miss is this dual monitor setup. So we have two of Holley's 12-inch Pro dashes. We're using Dominator ECU, along with a lot of the other stuff on this car that we've done. Kind of the goal is to keep things simple, easily accessible, serviceable, make things easy for down the road. So we built on the driver and passenger side, we had to create mounts for these displays. On the driver's side here, you can kind of see some of it curves down and matches some of the same shapes as the dash itself, the original dash that is. There's just a few pieces of hardware that need to be removed in order to pull all of this out. Behind this handheld display that we wanted to mount up here too, just so the customer could go through and make a couple simple changes on the fly if need be. We have a couple hidden mounts behind there. Mounts the handheld as well as mounts this main display bracket behind it. And then on the passenger side here, kind of same idea, a little bit different shape just because it's different from the driver's side, but clean, simple little mount behind this main dash. So for the wiring portion of this, that's kind of the only thing that we didn't have our hand in. The owner of this car, he owns a business dealing with smart homes and electronics, and he felt that it was pretty important for them to handle that part if this car was going to be a representation of his business, which we totally understand. So they flew up for a week to get all the wiring at least started and test systems that were in place. When the car leaves, goes back down to him, they'll be wrapping all that up. That's kind of why you see all this. It's not all like mounted or tied back yet, but that will be happening. With most of the wiring in place, at least good enough to start the car, we're able to do that a couple times just to be able to go over all the fuel lines, fittings and whatnot, check for any leaks if there were any. Moved on to the brake and clutch, bled both those out, bled the hydraulic handbrake, make sure all of those lines and fittings were good to go. The last thing that we wanted to do were just finalize all the doors and windows. So this car came to us, the doors were just empty. We didn't have any of those parts for the front doors or the quarter windows. So tracked down all of those parts and mechanisms, door handles, latches, strikers, got that all in place. And we went with power window regulators. So the rear quarters and the front doors are both power now. The last thing we did was add a fire suppression system. We mounted the fire suppression tank back here right behind the passenger seat. Had a nice flat spot to work with. And then you can see the lines routing up along here, and then it tees off and goes to a nozzle over on the passenger side. And then we have another one here I'll show in just a second on the driver's side, as well as a pull cable. Built a little bracket here on the transmission tunnel, kind of a good accessible spot for the driver or passenger to be able to pull. Here's just another view. Here's a driver's side nozzle here, and then that pull cable. We have that cable routed along the brake line here on the inside. And then up here in the engine bay, we have 2 additional fire suppression nozzles. So one here on the back of the passenger side, and then we have another one here on the back of the driver's side. One of the other big questions we got is just the overall weight of this car. We had weighed all the aluminum pieces before. We're gonna go ahead and throw all the body panels back on, get this thing on scales and see how much it weighs, because we're curious too. Okay, so we have the splitter back up on the car. Before, when we were checking wheel fit and whatnot, along with some of the body, we did end up kind of radiusing that splitter just for wheel clearance, tire clearance up front there. We did end up mounting the splitter up a little bit higher. The owner of the car does intend on street driving this car quite a bit as well. So he wanted to just have it tucked up and make sure that it's not going to be damaging it or having to really worry about that. We're going to set it on the scales and see how much it weighs.
What is it?
Take a guess.
What is it? 32. 2,900 pounds.
3273.
Wow.
That's 3273.
The same front rear.
That's not horrible.
No. It's
I
not
thought it was going to be front heavy.
That's almost, that's like 50-50.
Yeah.
Yeah.
20 pounds difference, like.
And that's no corner balance.
Mm-hmm.
You can fuck with it or mess with it.
Damn. Yeah, we literally haven't done anything. Just threw it on the...
Widowy.
All right. So we have a total weight of 3,274 pounds and almost a perfect 50-50 weight balance, which is really impressive because we haven't even quarter balanced the car or really adjusted much at all. So for setting it just straight down on the scales, I would say that's not bad. I don't know. I had no idea what this car was going to weigh. So I was just throwing out 3,600 pounds. Some of the other guys were like pretty confident it was going to be over 4. I thought it was going to be pretty front heavy, but yeah, not 50-50. So after seeing those weights, we just kind of wanted to do a little comparison. We were looking up new GT500 just to kind of compare the two. New GT500 says it weighs just under 4,200 pounds and makes about mid 700 horsepower. This thing weighs just a hair over 3,200 pounds, so it's almost 1,000 pounds lighter and makes 850 horsepower. So a little over 100 horsepower more. Pretty cool just to see some of the differences between there and the overall weight and how balanced that it ended up being. So our time with that Mustang's just about done. The owner's gonna take it and handle paint, upholstery, all the little finish stuff. We have some more pretty cool projects coming up. Let us know which ones you might be interested in seeing first. Say 1970 911, we're doing an RSR conversion on. Pretty cool. As you can see, all the paint and body work's done up to this point, but it's just a bare shell on a dolly. So we have a lot of work on this one. The other one's pretty cool. It's a 944 turbo. We're gonna be doing a turbo K series in. It's supposed to be capable of like 900 horsepower. If you guys liked seeing some of this stuff and want to see more of it, we'll try and put it out. Make sure to subscribe and ask any questions or comments if you guys want. We'll try and keep up with it. Thank you. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel here. You're gonna want to buckle up for this one. We got some crazy additions that we just made to this car. So come check this out. So, as a set of sequential, big for the 3 slave cylinders, master cylinders. So, fuck. Did I do that? Ended up seeing through. I don't know what I'm saying.